Hi, everyone. So we're looking at chapter 3, part 2 for this week, looking at the other side. So last week, we looked quite a bit at the 3 different types of claims that we could have, looking at frequency, association, and causal claims. Now we're going to cover part 2, where we look at the 4 different types of validities. So how can we interrogate those 3 different claims? How can we look into them and break them apart and see how valid they are, using the 4 big validities? And then how do we prioritize those validities is the real focus for this week in this lecture. So let's take a look at these. There are 4 different types of validities, and we'll talk about these a lot through the rest of the semester. And just to back up for 1 second, when we talk about something being valid, right, when we're asking if something is valid, we're asking, is it reasonable? Is it accurate? Is it justifiable? Those are synonyms for valid, right? So we're looking at, is something accurate? That's another word for validity, and kind of trying to critique that a little bit using these different types of validity. So we can talk about construct validity, external validity, statistical validity, and internal validity. So 4 different types, and we'll look at each one of them in this part of this chapter. So let's start with construct validity. Construct validity looks at how well a conceptual variable is operationalized, how well the variable is manipulated, or how well it is measured, depending on which one we're doing. And this is something that you might use to interrogate a frequency claim. So what are some constructs? A construct, if you remember, we talked about this before, a construct is an abstract concept that we would study, right? So in psychology, some of these abstract concepts or constructs might be things like happiness, depression, stress, intelligence. It's kind of a lofty, abstract concept. We need to take that lofty concept or construct and turn it into something that we can actually measure or manipulate. And when we do that, we are operationalizing that construct. So to operationalize something means to turn it into something that we can measure and manipulate. So for example, if we have a frequency claim saying that 80% of college students have been depressed during last year, how did they operationalize and measure depression? How could you potentially define and operationalize depression in a measurable way? So maybe somebody met the DSM criteria for depression, or maybe we qualified it as they went to therapy because they were struggling. And so we have to turn this abstract concept into something that we can define clearly and consistently. And when we do that, we are operationalizing that. So a construct validity looks at how well have we actually operationalized it? Are we capturing what we wanted to capture in the way that we defined and operationalized it? External validity, also often used to interrogate frequency claims, is how well the results of a study represent people or contexts besides the one in the study itself. So external validity helps us to answer the question, can the research be applied to the real world? Right? If your research is applicable to other experiments, other settings, people, or other times, then we say that it has high external validity. So if something has high external validity, the results of our experiment or our work, our claim, generalize to other people in other settings, other circumstances, and so on. If the research cannot be replicated or it doesn't apply to other settings or situations or people, then we would say the external validity is low. Now, one of the biggest threats to external validity has to do with making sure that the sample of people that we get for our claim or our experiment is really representative of the larger population being studied. We'll go into this quite a bit more when we get into sampling topics in a little bit in another chapter. But external validity is how well we can generalize or kind of stretch that research, and if it applies to other people, other situations, other settings, and so on. Statistical validity is the one that we'll look at the least in this class. It's something that you would look at quite a bit if you were to take a statistics class, but I do want you to know what it is, even if we won't go into it. Statistical validity is the extent to which a study's conclusions are reasonable and accurate in a statistical sense. So oftentimes when we make statistical claims, we're looking at how accurate or valid or likely are the claims that we're making. They often include something that we call a margin of error, a statistic based on sample size that indicates where the true value in the population probably lies. So any claim that we make will have a likely statistical validity. So this is something that we won't really go into for the purposes of this class. But I love this picture. I hate how everyone always overgeneralizes from small samples and anecdotes. Have you seen that a lot? Yeah, 3 times already this week, right? We have this tendency to make conclusions, but we have to look at how statistically valid are they as well. The last type that we're looking at causal claims and internal validity. So whenever we're interrogating a causal claims are things that we are claiming that we think that X can cause Y, right? They're typically coming from experiments. There are 3 criteria that we have in order to be able to imply causation. In order to infer that cause has been present, we have to meet 3 different criteria. One of them is covariance. 2 variables have to go together, as we saw in correlations or association claims. When 2 variables vary or associate or correlate with each other, that is the first step for inferring causation. We also have to have something called temporal precedence. One variable has to come before the other variable. For example, what would need to be shown for the claim more than 3 hours per day spent on social media causes depression? So you would need to show that somebody spent 3 or more hours a day and that came before the depression occurred, right? Having to establish temporal precedence. Finally, you have to have internal validity, the last of our validities, where we are looking at, have we eliminated any alternative explanations? Have we eliminated any confounds? Are we looking at what are alternative explanations, and have we made sure to systematically eliminate those so that we can actually draw the conclusion that A causes B or X causes Y or whatever? Now with internal validity, we are looking at, again, just a little bit more here. I'm not sure why I made it come up that way. Internal validity is an indication of a study's ability to eliminate all of those explanations. Another way of putting this is it refers to how well an experiment was done. Was it done in a really sound, strong way, or are there issues? Right? So that's what internal validity is examining. It's related to how many confounds or other explanations you might have in your experiment. To what degree does the study rule out other explanations, other third variables or confounds when it's studying the relationship between 2 things? A study that has high internal validity rules out most or all alternative explanations. So all of those third variables or confounds have been ruled out. We've controlled for them. We are confident that the change or manipulation in the independent variable is causing the change that we're measuring in the dependent variable because we've eliminated every other possible explanation. A study that has low internal validity doesn't rule out other explanations. There are third variables, there are confounds, there are other things that might be explaining the results. And so we are not confident that the changes and manipulations we're making are causing what we're measuring. So you want your experiments to have high internal validity. That way we're confident that it's been done well, we've ruled everything out. If it has low internal validity, then the conclusions that you're making might not be all that accurate. A little bit more on how experiments can support causal claims. So when we're talking about a causal claim, we're typically talking about experiments. We're going to talk about experiments a lot over the course of the semester, but in an experiment, we're manipulating something. We're deliberately manipulating to see how it affects something else. So we manipulate a circumstance and then we measure something else to see what the effect is. And 2 terms that come out of this, and we're going to be looking at these a lot, are independent and dependent variables. In an experiment, the independent variable is always going to be the thing that you manipulate. We assign participants to one level or another of the independent variable. It's the variable that the experimenter changes or manipulates and is assumed to have a direct effect on the dependent variable. So we're going to manipulate or change something to see how it affects something else. That something else would be the dependent variable. It's the one that we're measuring, the variable that's being tested or measured in an experiment. It's dependent on the independent variable. So if we were doing an experiment and we wanted to know what is the effect of sleep deprivation on somebody's exam scores, right? Then the independent variable would be sleep deprivation, right? So maybe we assign one subject to a group or a level where they get a full night of sleep. And another level is we don't let them sleep all night. And another one is we wake them up throughout the night multiple times. There could be multiple levels or conditions within the independent variable. And then the dependent variable would be the thing that we're measuring. We give them an exam and see what their score is. And then we can make a direct comparison between the scores of people who got a full night of sleep versus partial night versus no sleep. And we can make a causal claim that maybe sleep does affect somebody's exam score. Another way to help control for possible confounds is we randomly assign participants to the groups. So we would randomly assign people to the different levels of the independent variable. Maybe I have them pick a number out of a hat to determine who gets to be in the full sleep versus no sleep versus partial sleep group. And this helps to control for confounds. Now, a little trick that I learned a long time ago in my research methods class: when you're trying to figure out an independent or dependent variable in an experiment, ask yourself this question: what is the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable? What is the effect of the IV on the DV? So for example, what is the effect of sleep deprivation on exam scores? What is the effect of studying on exam scores? So whatever it is that you're changing is the independent variable, and whatever you're measuring is the dependent variable. Which of the four validities is the most important? It really depends on what kind of claim the researcher is making and your priorities, right? So depending on what you are trying to do and what you are prioritizing really dictates which of these different validities you might be focusing more on. They're all important in their own way, but depending on your claim and the assertions that you're making, it really dictates which one is the most important in your research. And this chart is in the book, and I think it's really, really helpful looking at frequency, association, and causal claims, and then how we might examine these four different types of validities for each. So I wanted to include this in here, and you should definitely look at it in the book, right? So how we can look at construct validity, statistical validity, internal validity, and external validity for each one of these types of claims. What questions are we asking? What is it that we're focusing on? You will see these four different types of validity throughout the rest of the semester, and we're only going to build on them. So make sure that you take the time to read the chapter, really understand and look at some of these examples. Hopefully the discussion for this week will also help you with that. So make sure you get going on all the other required materials for the week. Next week, we will move on to our next chapter. So I will see you all then. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week.